Water is our biggest limiting factor on all farming systems on Eyre Peninsula. And can we collect information on water availability within our soils at any time or any place in the landscape and then use that to make more profitable decisions? My view of how the project's been glued together is there's been a heap of work being done on soil characterisation that SARDI have done. We've linked that to soil moisture the soil moisture probes, created a different interface so that we can look at that in a better way. And then we've also, the CSIRO team have attempted a whole range of different methods to be able to extrapolate that information across the landscape. Peter's come in to try and glue some of that information about how we adapt to climate change and use climate information to help some of our decision-making process. What we've done at the bottom is then how do we actually use all this information to make better decisions? A lot of that discussion that we just had around understanding how variable soil of plant available water is across the landscape, what I would encourage all of you to do is to think about how useful that information is on the basis of the decisions that you've got to make at any time during the year. None of these options seem particularly groundbreaking on their own, but when cobbled together and getting them right in the right place can help growers really make some profitable decisions. So starting at the top, so that pre-season thing, like George just said, crop choice, and if George would have come to the Cropping After the Storm seminar last year, I did warn everyone not to grow lentils. So we do understand a lot about how, what soil moisture has on the effect that it, the following crop. And we can also make some decisions around that sowing time, where you're shooting for at that time of the year, whether you should be sowing earlier, later, because depending on where your moisture is. Once we get into the actual growing season, a lot of the decisions that we've got to make are essentially just nitrogen. Towards the tail end of the season, we're really, the only things that an understanding of soil moisture help us with is potentially some grain marketing, insurance, and harvest logistics. So they are the decisions that we've got to make with an improved use of soil moisture. Our approach has been, we chose 8 focus paddocks, and in June, when Geordie's thinking about his nitrogen strategy in 2020, the range of yield possibilities went from 1.5 tonne to 7.5 tonne, all based on environment. So if Geordie managed that crop as well as what he could have, he had a 6 tonne yield variation that was all driven by climate. Nothing that we can do anything about. This is that paddock at Geordie's again. So I've talked about, yes, understanding a little bit about soil moisture is important, and this is why. So this is that paddock at Geordie's in 2020. He cut hay in 2019 on some of the paddock, and my estimation of where he cut hay, he had 64 mils of plant available water at the start of the season, and where he had harvested that crop for grain, he drained an extra 40 mils out of the profile. That 40 mils resulted in an extra 3 tonne of grain production. So soil water in this environment is absolute gold. In that corresponding year, in 2020, in the probe paddock we've been looking at on Bruce's Place, yielded its socks off, 6.8 tonne, with a growing season rainfall of 420 and a bit of fallow rainfall. If you flick that forward 12 months, yield's almost half. Essentially the same, well, maybe an inch less growing season rainfall, but not that much. And you go forward to a barley crop that he had last year, we're back in the above 5 category. If you look at the soil moisture probe outputs in this paddock, 2020, this is August, when this is the last roll of the dice type of time, when you can decide whether you're going to go out there and chase that 5 tonne yield, or are we looking at 3 tonne. So in 2020, when he yielded 6.8 tonnes, the bucket was about half full. 2021 we were full, and similarly we were very close to full last year. And so what this is telling me is that soil moisture, particularly at that time in August, we're not getting any signal on how yield is going to perform towards the end of the season. This is actually a yield profit report for Dan's paddock in July last year. And I think what we've learnt from Dan's paddock, and the same is true for all of the focus sites, is that by creating this high level of information and creating confidence in the information that we're working with, we can better understand the restrictions and the opportunities that those paddocks have got to offer. So in the case of Dan's place, the opportunity for him to pull this nitrogen limited line over to the water limited line is a lot less risky, because he doesn't have that downside from having a constrained soil. And so the decision to just apply nitrogen and chase these really high yields becomes a lot easier. When we started this project, a year 6 tonne yield was fantastic, but now we're entertaining the ideas of pushing 8 tonne. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we learned about nitrogen last year. This is the yield map from Bruce's last year. So we had a nitrogen trial in this really high yielding part of the paddock. So we're going up from 5.3 in the blue, yeah, down to 3 down here in the red. So we had a nitrogen trials here and here. And this is what we learnt. In the good part, there was a really good, so this is just essentially nitrogen added across this axis, and a partial gross margin, a partial niche margin, so yield minus the fertiliser cost going up this way. And so, yeah, working out where we applied more nitrogen in a fantastic year, you could just apply lots of nitrogen in a soil that wasn't constrained, what we're calling the good bit, and it was a really good return on investment. Where the soil was a bit more constrained, it wasn't such a good investment. We walked into this paddock knowing that we had this range of possibilities that were going to happen. We could fertilise accordingly, and so this is just taking this step change from moving out from the probe that's here, because we had some historical yield data. We knew that these bits yielded better and worse, and then we can start managing those zones accordingly. The other one that I was going to finish off on is this idea of mineralisation. So this is again Bruce's paddock in the good and the poor bits of the paddock, and this is how much nitrogen was available, or the crop saw throughout the growing season. You can see why we didn't get a nitrogen response in that poor place, in that poor part of the paddock, because we haven't been removing a lot of nitrogen from that part of the paddock for a number of years. It was sitting on a fairly big bulge of nitrogen, and we only started to really wear that down towards the end of the season. We never really drained the system. In the better part of the paddock, where it has been performing really well over a number of years, we didn't start off with the same amount of nitrogen, and we wore that out by the start of October, so it was really looking for some extra nitrogen. The point that I was getting to here is that we have got this end source that's sitting somewhere between 50 and 150 kilos of urea becoming available to us during the growing season, and that if we're trying to fine-tune our nitrogen management with all of these other variables like climate variability as well, how accurate can we reasonably be to be able to nail down that we need to put 46.2 kilos of nitrogen in that place and 22.1 over there? So is that realistic? Yeah, I just thought I'd spend the last few slides just talking about some of the things that our reflections, or my reflections, and Jake's on board with me because I pay him a salary, about what we've learnt. So when we go out and talk to growers about this project, everyone's keen to understand more about soil moisture and how it varies, particularly how it varies across their properties. But what we've continually come up against is that making practice changes that use that information requires a deeper understanding to develop confidence. Discussions around how you use this information have been more important than actually, to create confidence than some simple recipe that, you know, this much soil moisture, this much nitrogen equals this much yield. Where I see the real resilience in farming systems on Eyre Peninsula is, yes, understanding that nitrogen is a big limiting factor, but being able to then understand that, well, there's so much of this that's out of our control, either through environmental conditions that happen after those nitrogen spreads are happening. So how do we put our farming system into a position where we don't need to play the season every year?